couple that had been married for 60 years. And in fact, they were in a convalescent home at this time. Even though they'd been married for so many years, they seemingly could never get along. And even in their older age, they seemed to fight every day. From the time they would wake up in the morning to the time they'd go to bed at night, they would fight. And they finally were warned by the officials of the convalescent home, look, if you don't stop this, we're going to kick you out of this place. And so they stopped to think for a while, and then the lady said, look, Joe, I have an idea. She says, won't we pray that God might take one of us home? And after the funeral, I'll go live with my sister. Someone said marriage is great. It's the living with one another afterwards that's the problem. And the reason that someone would say that, and the reason there's so many jokes about marriage, is because of the conflict and how difficult it is to live together as husbands and wives. Well, husbands and wives need to learn how to work through that process. No one has it wired, and it doesn't matter how long you've been married. You still work at the process of how to work through, conflict, how to come together as a husband and wife. One thing that we need to say is that when conflict comes, there are a couple of things that we need to understand. One, we shouldn't see it as a threat to the marriage to the point that you feel like the marriage is on the rocks. Now, if it continues to happen, that's another story. But so often, couples in marriage, when they come to the issue of conflict, they think, wow, I didn't, especially right after they've been married, just gotten married, they think, wow, I didn't know it was going to be like this, and wow, are we going to survive? And it shouldn't be that way. It shouldn't think that way. Also, it doesn't necessarily have to lead to a knockdown, drag-out kind of fight, conflict. Another thing that we need to understand, too, is that sometimes Christians have the image that in marriage, if you are a Christian and if you walk with God, then you shouldn't have any conflict. Debbie and I, years ago in Southern California, we went to a wedding, and it was one of these weddings. At the end of the wedding, the bride and groom, they turned around, and the groom took the microphone, and he began to talk about their relationship, which was good and fine. But he said, we've never had any conflict at all. With the intimation that that's what their marriage was going to be. Ruth Graham once said, Billy Graham's wife once said, if you never have conflict, one of you is unnecessary. Did you get that? Understand that? There is conflict. You're going to have conflict. And the point that you need to understand is that conflict can be good if you learn how to work it through in the way that we've been talking about the last several weeks in this series, Marriage Built to Last. Today, we're going to talk about how to handle conflict God's way. The last 2 weeks, we talked about how to communicate God's way and how to communicate as Christ would have us communicate. So today, we're going to go to a passage in just a few moments, an incredible passage, a great passage. It's in the book of James, and I love James, the apostle of James. But before we get to that passage that I think will help us work through or understand how to work through conflict and how to approach conflict, perhaps better said, I want us to kind of do a flyover as to what are the things that will cause conflict in a marriage relationship. And again, it's just a flyover. We're not going to spend a lot of time on each of these, but let me just mention them because these together will serve as a backdrop to a lot of what we will say as we get to the main part of the message. The first thing that causes conflict in a marriage relationship is that of differences. Conflicts arise out of differences, and I might add, out of differentness. When I say differences, differences of opinion, differences of perspective. But also, there is that term that I've chosen to use often. It's a word, differentness. That just by virtue of our differentness, not just male and female, but even our backgrounds, how we're made, how we think, all of those things can add and cause conflict. So just because you have those things, though, doesn't mean you have to have conflict, but so often they do lead to conflict. People, no doubt, are different from one another, husbands and wives. They have different abilities, they have different amounts of knowledge, different likes and dislikes, different perspectives, different backgrounds, different expectations. Howard and Charlotte Kleinbel, in the book The Intimate Marriage, says, "A relationship which spells closeness also spells conflict. Some conflict, unhappiness, frustration, and anger are inherent and inescapable in every marriage relationship simply because they are in the fabric of all human relationships." Let me go back to the illustration I used last week. Someone has likened marriage to porcupines living in Alaska. And I said that what happens is when the winter comes and they try to come together to warm their bodies, what happens? The quills stick each other, and so they draw apart. And so, again, when they draw apart, they feel the blast of the cold winter. And so they come back together, and as they come back together, this time they learn to adjust their quills so that they can come together so that each body will warm the other. That's marriage. We come together often in marriage with our backgrounds, our perspective, our emotional baggage, often. All these things, and we have to learn how to work through all of that and to come to a place where we can accept and love and communicate and work through conflict together. So first, differences. Secondly, would be offenses. A very serious cause of conflict is a wrong response to an offense. Now, obviously, if you're offended, then you're going to be upset. But I think what often causes the greatest problem, and I'm guilty of this as anybody else, is that when one spouse is offended, the other spouse responds back in like kind. There's no reason an offense must lead to a conflict. Nonetheless, it often does. You often see it on a football field or anywhere for that matter. And one guy will push another guy, and the guy that's pushed, what does he do? He gets more riled than the one who pushed him, and he fights back, and he's the one that gets the penalty, right? That's often the way it works. Well, when we respond back to an offense, it only heightens the conflict. I've said this in previous weeks, but let's say it again. It should be the goal of every husband and wife to learn how to respond with humility and graciousness to one another's offenses. Romans 12:17 says, "Never pay back evil for evil to anyone. Respect what is right in the sight of" what? "All men." And that would include your spouse, would it not? Proverbs 17:27 says, "He who restrains his words has knowledge, and he who has a cool spirit is a man of understanding." In other words, the person who holds his tongue, bites his tongue, is a person who's wise, who has a cool spirit. We might say a gracious spirit. Now here's the third, and this is going to connect right into what we're going to be talking about today in our passage in James. The third cause of offense is that of pride, and you can put it as a parenthetical statement, and the flesh. Whether conflict arises out of a difference or an offense, it ultimately will stem from a self-exalting pride to have one's way, or from a self-serving desire to have one's needs met above the hurts, the needs of your spouse. Proverbs 28:25 says, "An arrogant man stirs up strife, but he who trusts in the Lord will" what? Prosper. Proverbs 13:10 says, "Only by pride cometh contention." Let me read that one more time. Only by pride cometh what? Contention. But with the well-advised is wisdom. What was Solomon saying? Solomon was saying, listen, pride keeps us from listening and causes conflict, so put down the pride and listen to good counsel. Essentially what he said. It is vitally important that husbands and wives grasp the connection between pride and conflict. And by the way, everything we're talking about here in terms of the marriage relationship applies to any relationship. Applies to you living out in the world. These same things that I've mentioned today that will cause conflict are the same things that will cause conflict in your workplace, at your school, wherever you are. Now, but it's vitally important that husbands and wives understand this connection. Well, let's just go to James chapter 4. James chapter 4. In James, in this epistle, he tells us that conflict and quarrels are the outworking of our own prideful, watch this, desires. Our own prideful desires. Look in chapter 4 of James. We're going to get to chapter 3 in just a moment. But look in chapter 4, verse 1. It says, "What is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? Is not the source your pleasure that wages war in your members?" He says, "You lust and you do not have, so you commit murder." And by the way, it's not talking about physical murder here. It's talking about the murder that comes with the tongue. With the tongue. It says you lust, and by the way, the word lust here is not primarily speaking in the context of sensual lust. Could include that, but what this is talking about is the lust that we have in this old nature of ours to have it our way. More about that in just a moment. What's interesting here in this context is that James uses some very interesting words here. The word, for example, quarrels, means a military campaign or a chronic state of war. It's a military term. The word conflict speaks of a separate conflict within a war or a small battle within a war. So James here is talking to believers now. He's not talking about marriage, but he's talking to believers. He's talking to believers in the church. And he says, this is what happens when you don't get your way. When you don't get your way, what does it cause? It causes major campaigns of conflict and even small battles within that conflict. You see, what is it that he's talking about here? He's saying when things don't go the way you want them to go, you set up this major battle. We call it control, right? We set up a situation so that we can gain somehow control of the situation to have our way. And one of the ways we do that is through our tongue in various ways. He says, that's not good. Why? Because it kills people. It kills God's children. So when it's said that God's army is the only army that shoots its own wounded, and we do that often. But what's he talking about here? Our own way. Well, go over to chapter 3, back to chapter 3 that was read earlier. Great passage. He says, but if, in verse 14, it says, but if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your heart, do not be arrogant and so lie against the truth. Now understand that what I'm reading here comes before everything that James has said in chapter 4, verse 1. So what James is talking about here in this lusting and killing and so forth, all of it points back to this previous passage. You get that? You following here? You tracking? It says, but you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your heart. Do not be arrogant and so lie against the truth. Well, for this wisdom is not that which comes down from above, but is, now watch this is powerful. It's earthly, it's natural. In other words, what's he saying? He's saying it's first of the world. Secondly, he says it's natural, it's coming from the old nature. And watch this next one. And it's what? Say it for me. Demonic. He's saying this kind of nature relates back to the father of the world, Satan himself. Strong words. Now watch verse 16. It says, for where jealousy and selfish ambition exists, there is disorder and every what? Evil thing. Disorder in every evil thing. Now, I don't know that I need to go into detail as to what bitter jealousy is. I think we probably know what that is. But what about the whole thing of selfish ambition? What does that mean? Well, let me just share with you what I think it does. Selfish ambition becomes my way, my feelings, my rights, my expectations, my needs, my plans. John MacArthur said it well about this particular passage. He said, those whose lives are based on and motivated by human, ungodly wisdom are inevitably self-centered, living in a world in which their own personal ideas, desires, and standards are the measure of everything. Whatever and whoever serves those ends is considered good and friendly. Whatever and whoever threatens those ends is considered bad and an enemy. Those who are engulfed in self-serving worldly wisdom resent anyone or anything that comes between them and their own objectives. And does that happen in a marriage? Yeah. When our goals become fulfilling our fleshly desires, we will have conflict. And you see, if believers are going to be able to step out of the battle and the conflict and avoid the conflict, they have to recognize the things that are of the flesh. Husbands and wives, it's not Burger King. You can't have it your way. That's part of the problem today in our country, is we have so many children who are who are getting married, and they're not growing up, and so when they get married, things don't change, and so it's all about me. And basically, marriage is all about one's myopic, narcissistic viewpoint. Now, how do you do this? How do you step out of this? How do you learn to get past this? Well, we're going to look at a passage today that has more to do with attitude, more to do with characteristics, virtues. Today is not, if you came today thinking, oh boy, he's going to go through a list of things that will help me work through conflict. I can do that, and I do that often in marriage seminars that I do, but that's not what this is about today. What this is about what James says should be a part of any person's makeup, demeanor, disposition, attitude in relating to other people. You know, one of the things I love about James is that he's the apostle who gets the cookies on the lower shelf. He brings it right down to the lower shelf, and he says, this is what it means. This is what this means. Paul sometimes can move around in the abstract and speak in the abstract. I'm talking about the Apostle Paul. He can move around in the abstract and speak in things in terms of lexical definitions. James is wonderful about giving what I call behavioral definitions. In fact, in my personal view, this is the counterpart. This passage that we're about to look at is the counterpart to what Paul says over in Galatians chapter 5 when he talks about the fruit of the Spirit. Those are great definitions of the fruit of the Spirit, right? One fruit of the Spirit. James says, okay, you want to know what? You want to take a snapshot of that? Here it is. And that's what he does here in James chapter 3. So, in order to deal with conflict and to be prepared for conflict, I think we have to have God's wisdom. And that's what this is all about. Solomon wrote, acquire wisdom, and with all your acquiring, get understanding. 900 years later, in the first century, the Roman philosopher Cicero stated that wisdom is the best gift of the gods, the mother of all good things. Now, both men considered wisdom to be the highest and most noble of all virtues. The difference, though, however, is the word sophos in the Greek, word for wisdom, was often used by the Greeks to designate speculative knowledge, theory, or philosophy. But the Hebrew people knew otherwise. The Hebrew people knew that wisdom is much different. Wisdom is this. Wisdom is being able to take truth and to relate it to life. Being able to take truth and to relate it to life. You see, it's one thing to know all this, and I've seen Christians over the years who are Bible encyclopedias. They know it up here. They can give you all the right answers. But when it comes to their life and applying those principles, for some reason, those principles do not get out in terms of the shoe leather of life. James says this is wisdom. This is the application of truth. This is what real truth is when it's lived out in relationship or relationships. What is it? Well, look in verse 17. It says, but the wisdom from above is first what? Pure. Now, keep in mind, what James is talking about has to do with what believers are to flesh out in relationship to other believers. But as I said last week, if our spouse has trusted Christ, and for most of us here that's true, I would think, then we should do the same with them. In fact, perhaps there's a greater accountability. So what does it mean, first, that wisdom from above is pure? Well, the word means undefiled in the Greek. And certainly that would mean morally pure. But the context means something else. The context has to do with one's motive. One's motive. This means, in terms of the Christian life and in terms of relating to other believers, it means that I come to other believers with a pure motive. It means I don't come and show empathy and compassion for someone else because in reality I want to use them for my gain or favor. It means I really love people for the sake of loving people. That's the idea. In a marriage relationship, it means that when I interact with my spouse, I need to ask myself, am I desiring to talk with my spouse to get my way, or to manipulate my spouse, or to control my spouse, or to have my, now watch this, have my needs met first? I talked about last week about not using manipulation in communication. Fritz Reidenauer was a guy who wrote for Gospel Light for many years. Many of you, if you've been in the church for a long time, you probably have read one of his commentaries under the publisher Gospel Light. He said this. He says, before turning your guns, especially your spiritual guns, on someone's ideas, attitudes, actions, ask yourself a couple of questions. Am I trying to help this person, or am I really trying to impose my value system on him or her? Do I respect and like this person for what he or she is? Or am I trying to make him or her over to suit, now watch this, to suit my idea of what is respectable, likable, and spiritual? In other words, am I trying to make that person over into my own image? And so often that's what happens in a marriage relationship. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, the love chapter, verse 5 says, speaking of love, says it does not seek its what? Its own. So first, there should be a pure motive. Secondly, there should be a desire for peace. In that passage, again, in verse 17, it says, wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable. What does that mean? Well, the NIV says peace-loving. Literally, in the Greek text, it is peaceful. That means that it's not abrasive, it's not vindictive, it's not judgmental, it's not divisive. I said a few weeks ago that speech that is seasoned with salt is speech that's not insidious. It's not hurt. It's not abrasive. It's peaceable. Now, I'm not suggesting here an attitude of peace by abdication. I'm not suggesting here that you should seek to have peace above everything else without ever dealing with real issues. There are some couples who they ignore things. They just push them aside. Or maybe one person in the marriage relationship. I had one lady who came to see me in Southern California, young couple, Margaret, and she wouldn't mind me sharing this. She could not say no to anyone, including her husband. And her husband, Chris, was one of the most caring, gracious, compassionate guy I've ever met. But she could never share her feelings, and she could never say to her husband or anyone else, for that matter, no, I don't want to do that. And so she came one day and just unloaded on me. I said, Margaret. And so we had to work through a process by which she understood who she was in Christ so that she could say no. And that her saying no doesn't have anything to do, or I should say it this way, her saying no should not allow others to interpret who she is. She understood that finally. There are other couples who, when there's conflict, they just push it under the rug. And what happens with that is that they begin to save up what I call emotional trading stamps. Jerry, we have that you came home late again and forgot to call me. You never say, or he never says he loves me. You don't help me discipline the kids. You know, I'm trapped with diapers. I think a dishpan. It's hard for me to see here. dustpan, diapers, dishes, and dustpan. He lives it up going out to lunch with his friends, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The idea that, again, she's saving up these emotional trading stamps. What happens when that happens? Boom. Finally, Judgment Day comes, and it's not nice. There's a way to discuss those difficult issues in a peaceful way. One scholar, Edmund Hibert, said this: "It will not compromise," speaking of this word, by the way, "it will not compromise with sin to maintain peace. But even when fighting against sin, it hungers for peace, yearning to heal all divisions by its wise counsel." Romans 12:18 says, "If possible, so far as depends on you, live at peace with all men." And look at verse 18 in your passage. It says, "And the seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace." The seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who what? Who make peace. The next thing here that we see in this passage, back in verse 17, says, "But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle." Gentle is the next word. Now you look at that word and you read that word and you think, what does that have to do with conflict in terms of, and here's the point. The point here is the point is a refusal to get even. A refusal to get even. And so you see the word gentle and you say, well, what does that have to do with a refusal to get even? Well, it's a difficult word to translate. Barclay said it's almost an untranslatable term. The Greek scholar Archbishop Trench said there is no word in English or Latin to adequately translate this word. Gabeline, another scholar, said it describes the kind of person who, though wronged and possessing the right not to bend, nevertheless forgoes his rights. Forgoes his rights. Kind of gives the idea of one who has a heart of forgiveness, right? David Slagle is from Lawrenceville, Georgia. Don't know him, but he told this story, and I read it. Said that when he was a nurse for many years, he worked in the emergency room. And he said one time there was a couple that came in, and each one had a gunshot in their arm. He said as he was standing there about to do the paperwork, he heard them say something between each other. And he said it's something that you read or hear in a country music song. But here's what you need to know before I read what they said. The reason they had gunshot wounds, husband and wife, is because his wife forgot to set the clock for his first day at a new job. And so he got up late. He got so enraged by it that he got a gun and shot her in the arm. She went into the next room, got a shotgun, came back and shot him in the arm. And so here they are rolling in on a gurney into the emergency room. But David Slagle said what was interesting is what he heard next. Listen, as he described it. He said, separated by a deputy sheriff and handcuffed to their respective stretchers, the husband began, "I love you, baby, and I'm sorry I shot you." The wife responded, "I love you too, baby, and I'm sorry I shot you." There are things that we say in a marriage relationship that inflict harm and hurt and pain. But If we have the mind of Christ, if we're empowered by the Spirit of God, we will have a desire not to get even, but in fact to do as these two, to forgive. Jerry, got the other graphic? Here's another graphic. I'm sorry, honey. And he says, I'm sorry too. Let's forget it. So conflict can be good if you can learn to work through conflict. But one of the things that you have to have is the mind of Christ that says, I will refuse to get even. I will refuse to save those emotional trading stamps. I will seek to forgive more than anything else. Now here's the next, and I call it open to reasoning. Open to reasoning. It says, but the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, reasonable. The NIV has an interesting translation here. The NIV says submissive. It's an interesting Greek word, and it's interesting by the very fact that they translated that word that way. I would not have translated it that way, but nonetheless, that's a pretty good translation. It means easy to be entreated. It's only used here in all of the New Testament, not used anywhere else. Pastor Kent Hughes said this. He said, the rendering of submissive is fine if one understands it as willing to submit to persuasion or open to reason. Open to reason. A good example of this has to do with Nabal and Abigail in the Old Testament. Remember that? David had many of his men who worked for Nabal. And finally payday came, and Joseph's men came to Nabal to get their pay. And he said, what? He said, I don't owe you anything. In fact, I don't even know who these men you're talking about. And David, the word got back to David. You know the story. David was livid, right? And he says, men, get your swords, get on your horse. We're going to go down here and we're going to take care of everybody who are any way, in any shape related to this guy. And so on the way, you know the story, Abigail, his wife, intercepted David on the way down, and she began to appeal to him. Of course, she first gave him food. She appealed to him through his stomach. That's the way you appeal to men, I guess. And but then she began to say, you're better than this. You're a whole lot better than this. Don't let this, what's happened to you, what my husband has done to you, don't allow that to cause you to lower yourself, essentially, is what she said. And David responded by saying, may you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands. What was it about David's spirit that was critical there? He was willing to listen to reasoning. And in a marriage relationship, there has to be a willingness, when you come to the conflict, there has to be a willingness to listen to reasoning. That there should be a heart that says, I want to hear what my spouse has to say. If I've missed this thing, I want to understand how I've missed that. Now that's difficult to do when you're really angry, right? But that's the point. Here's the next. It says, in the next part here, it says, wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy. You get that? And here's what I say this is. This is you're willing to give grace, to give mercy. It says full of mercy and good fruit. It's a double characteristic, in fact. It stands in contrast to every vile deed. Let me tell you what I think this means. I think this means that you're willing, let's take it outside of the marriage relationship. It means that as a believer, with your fellow believers, you're willing to give the other person the benefit of the doubt. What's the first thing we do? We hear something bad about somebody else, what do we write them off. We say, I knew that person wasn't any good. Someone shares a tidbit of gossip that's negative about somebody else, and what happens? We latch on to it sometimes. Instead of saying, wait a minute, I know that person. I've lived with that person and rubbed shoulders with that person for years. I know that's not true. Now, let's take that and bring it into the marriage relationship. What does it mean? It means that I'm willing to extend grace and to hear before jumping to false conclusions. Remember what I said a few weeks ago? The epitome, if you know this statement, say it with me. The epitome of bad communication is what? False assumption. And oftentimes in a marriage conflict, what happens is when we jump to a false assumption. We think, well, she did this, so she meant this, or he did this, so he meant this, and we go on with that whole idea. Instead of saying, I want to extend grace. I'm going to extend grace until I hear my partner out. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. I was sharing this a number of years ago. I was discussing this with a group of pastors. I happened to be leading the group that day. We were going over this passage, and one of the pastors, when I started talking about giving others the benefit of the doubt, one of the pastors said, that's grace. Exactly. It's grace in action. Let me give you a contrast between what would be selfish thoughts. And by the way, keep in mind that all of this is against the backdrop of what? Bitter jealousy and selfish ambition. That's what James is talking about here. Everything he says is in contrast to that. Now keep that in mind. Now I want to give you a contrast between selfish thoughts and thoughts that are full of mercy. For example, someone might say, that's ridiculous. However, a thought that's full of mercy would say, she may or he may have a point. A selfish thought might be, I will have it my way. A thought that's full of mercy would say, I don't have to have it my way. It doesn't always have to be my way. It's okay to lose sometimes. Another selfish thought would be, how dare she or he like my rights? A thought that's full of mercy would be, what is her hurt? What is his hurt or pain? In other words, when that verbal grenade comes flying back at you, instead of putting up the wall and beginning to throw other verbal grenades back over, stop and ask, what's the hurt? What's the pain here? Why? Why are they saying that? And if you get to that point, man, you're on your way. But so often we can't because we take it personally, right? Here's the last here. I will not be treated this way. The thought of mercy is, how can I return good to her or him? Let me give you a couple more here. We have to wrap. The next thing we see in this passage, it says unwavering. I call this always consistent. The NIV says impartial. The Greek word is an interesting word. It means not divided. It's made up of two Greek words, one which means through and the other means to judge. And so it means to judge through or be divided. And so here it says it means unwavering, not divided. And that's the idea that Paul used and James used, in fact. Not just here, but in other places, to speak of a double-minded person. Very similar words that are used in the Greek text. And what he was saying here is that you're not one thing here and then the next you're a different person. You're not a mate that's capricious, that one day you love your spouse, the next day you just can't stand them. And by the way, this speaks to the issue of commitment. It means that every day you are committed to that spouse. Not one day and the next day not the other. You have a covenant with that spouse, and you're committed to that covenant. And listen to this, and you've heard me say this many times before. It's not based upon how you feel about that person at the time. And here's the last. It says, without hypocrisy. This means wisdom that is free from pretense. You don't say one thing and mean another. So, what does all this mean in terms of conflict? And remember again, the context has to do with believers relating to other believers, but it certainly applies to you relating to your spouse. So what does it mean? Well, here's what I think it means. It means that with your spouse, you have a pure desire for peace and reconciliation and nothing less, without any punitive desire, without any insidious motive or desire to, now watch this, desire to gain control. And you submit, here I'm going to say that, I'm going to use that word, you submit yourself to that person with a desire to understand from whence he or she comes. There's no self-protective manipulating or controlling. And you do it by giving that person the benefit of the doubt. You don't jump to conclusions and then judge the person before they have ever had the opportunity to give their side of the story. Here's the deal. This is all about, I'll go back to what I said in the beginning. This is all about being empowered by the Spirit of God. It's all about that. So here's two things you have to take home with you. You must be willing to deny self. Secondly, you must be yielded to God's Spirit. We're not wired to love in the way that Paul and James instruct us to love. It takes the Spirit of God not only living in us, but living through us. And at any moment in conflict, when we enter into that warfare that James talks about, we have stepped out of the Spirit and into the flesh. So our prayer is, God, help me to walk in your Spirit and to love my spouse and to resolve our conflict as you would have us resolve our conflict. Let's pray.